This is a story of Moses. Pharaoh has finally relented and agreed to let his people go. And so the Israelites have begun to leave Egypt. But Pharaoh has changed his mind, and his army is in pursuit. Hear these words from Exodus, beginning in chapter 14 at the 19th verse. The angel of God, who was going out ahead of the Israelite army, moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and took its place behind them. And it came between the army of Israel and the army of Egypt. And the cloud was there with the darkness, and it lit up the night. And one did not approach the other all night. Then Moses stretched his hand out over the sea, and the Lord brought and pushed back the sea with a strong east wind that blew all night. And the sea became dry land, and the waters were divided. And the Israelites stepped into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them into the sea, all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots and chariot drivers. At the morning watch, the Lord, in the pillar of fire and cloud, looked down on the Egyptian army and threw them into a panic. He clogged the wheels of their chariots so that they turned with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, "We should flee these Israelites, for the Lord is clearly fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch your hand out over the sea again, so that the waters might return and cover up the chariots and the chariot drivers." And so Moses stretched his hand out over the sea as he had been commanded. And at dawn, the waters returned to their normal level. As the Egyptians fled before the rising waters, the Lord picked them up and tossed them into the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the chariot drivers and all of the armies of the Pharaoh who had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. But the Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the Egyptians. And Israel saw the good things that the Lord had done against Egypt. And so the people feared God, and they believed in God and in his servant Moses. Then Moses and the Israelites sang a song to the Lord. And Miriam, the prophet, the sister of Aaron, took a tambourine in her hand, and all of the women followed her out, playing the tambourine and dancing. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Welcome to week 4 on the sermon series on Moses. Week 1 featured the tale of the burning bush and Moses discerning the whispers of God telling him to return to Egypt and liberate his fellow Hebrews. That passage prompted us to contemplate the ways God calls each of us. Next, we focus on the way Moses responded to God's call with great reluctance, and we are prone to doing the same. We often doubt we have what it takes. Yet, when we embrace God's call, we become our best selves. Last week, we noted that living our faith takes a great deal of courage. By tapping into God's Spirit within us, we can discover the courage to face whatever pharaohs we encounter. This morning, we leap forward in the saga. We're skipping over the chapters in which Moses threatened Pharaoh with 10 plagues, and the Egyptian people suffered the consequences of each one. The last plague broke Pharaoh's determination to keep all of those Hebrew people captive. He finally let those people go free. They had brought so much pain and suffering to Egypt, he was glad to see them go. However, shortly after he had removed their shackles and the Hebrew people began their dash to freedom, Pharaoh had second thoughts. What's he going to do without all this great labor? Who's going to do the work? He rounded up his army and headed in hot pursuit after the Hebrews to recapture them. The story says that God led them on their journey by appearing as a pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire at night. For those interested in the different images of God we find in Scripture, note that these are not human-like projections, but rather images that have been taken from nature. By cloud and fire, God led the escapees to what legend tells us was the Red Sea. But what the actual Hebrew words say is the Sea of Reeds, something more akin to a marsh with stalks coming up out of it. Now keep in mind that the saga of Moses is told about an event that occurred in the 13th century before the Common Era. Storytellers passed along the message. They told these stories for generations and generations, and it was centuries before finally being assembled in some sort of written form. Over all that time, there were bound to be some embellishments. And that's probably when the Sea of Reeds changed to the Red Sea. Since that story is more historical fiction with widening circles of meaning rather than flat historical fact, I think it's right for us to picture in our minds a large body of water, because it has overtones of the watery chaos of creation and how God made the dry land appear in its midst. Now, regardless of how we picture the sea, the Hebrew people are encamped next to it. The Egyptians are bearing down on them. The Hebrew people appear to be cornered, and it's at this point that we pick up today's passage. As the Egyptians are drawing near, a strong east wind blows, and it blows all night long. And it blows the water so far that land begins to appear. The Hebrews, seeing this land, cross it to the other side. The Egyptian army pursues them, but the wheels of their chariots become clogged in the muck. As the Hebrews reach the other side, the wind subsides, the water rushes back and drowns the Egyptian army. Moses leads the people in songs of triumph. Miriam leads the women in dancing. It's one of the most familiar passages in all of Hebrew Scripture, but it's also troubling. Most people will celebrate when a brutal oppressor like a Hitler is dead. But the story cannot help but make you wonder if God could have just kept all those Egyptians stuck in the mire rather than drowning every last one of them. 20 chapters later, Exodus will say about God that God has been revealed as merciful and gracious, abounding in steadfast love. But that's not quite the way God sounds in this story. The epic of the Exodus is the consummate story of the Hebrew people. It contains practically everything regarding the life of faith. The saga informs us that God is distressed when people suffer, that God works to liberate people who are oppressed, that God summons people to difficult missions, that human beings are free to accept or reject God's call. We doubt our ability to meet God's challenges. Life is both precarious and unpredictable. We complain and threaten to give up our faith when troubles arise. God can fill us with courage. God opens up new possibilities when there appears to be none available. God provides our daily bread, and God delivers us from death to life. For centuries, people of faith have identified with this story because it details our experiences of the life of faith. This portion of the Exodus for today, the story of the Hebrews crossing the Red Sea, was a liminal moment. A liminal moment is a point where you leave one place and enter another. It's a place of transition. To cross the sea is to cross a threshold, to cross a boundary. It represents liberation from slavery to freedom. It's hardly any wonder then that this narrative of the Exodus is at the core of the Jewish faith. In fact, Moses is recognized as such a towering figure that he's been a defining symbol in our own nation's struggle for freedom. A few years ago, Time magazine published an article entitled "How Moses Shaped America." It began by noting that from the American Revolution to the Civil Rights Movement, Moses has been one of America's cultural symbols. As a result of religious persecution in Europe, the earliest pilgrims found in Moses the inspiration to make the journey to a new land of freedom. This image was so archetypal that when Benjamin Franklin proposed a new seal for the United States, he pictured Moses leading the Hebrew people through the Red Sea. Images of Moses inspired leaders of the Underground Railroad, getting slaves to the north. Frederick Douglass was called Moses, as was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. later in the Civil Rights Movement. The story of the Red Sea is a story of slavery to freedom, of death to life. Biblical scholar John Holbert says it's nothing less than the Jewish resurrection story. Out of the hopelessness of slavery and death appeared life and a future with God. The story of the crossing of the sea is a story of breaking free from whatever is destroying you and living in new ways. It could represent a person's bondage to alcohol and drugs and then breaking free from the addiction. It could represent breaking free from a toxic relationship or a miserable job. It could represent moving from guilt to forgiveness, from fear to courage, from strife to peace. I have some sad news. The current uplifting and edifying political election is coming to an end. You're going to miss all of those ads, those beautiful and truthful ads running over and over ad nauseum. The Egyptians had to suffer under plagues of frogs and boils and locusts, but they didn't have to suffer the plague of the political election. It's been nasty. I can't begin to express how grateful I am that this election is finally coming to a halt. It has not merely exposed the stark divisions in our country, it has thrown gallons of gasoline on the flames of fear, which has led to bitterness and strife. Differences of opinion have made this nation great, but disdain for fellow citizens because they see the issues differently isn't merely counterproductive, it is destructive. Even though many cannot imagine how others could view life so differently, disdain toward well-meaning people who hold a contrary opinion can shred the fabric of our nation. If we choose to model ourselves after those who denigrate people with whom they disagree, whether they are political leaders or commentators or religious leaders or business leaders, we will continue to foment rancor and discord. The health of our nation will just continue to erode. Like the Hebrew people liberated from Egypt, we must seek to be liberated from fears that create prejudice and prompt vitriolic rhetoric, which in turn destroys personal relationships and all those ties that bind us together as a community and a nation. It's right to hold malice toward evil. God despises injustice and wants us to right what is wrong. However, rancor toward people simply because they hold different opinions, or because they are from another political party, or another race, or another religion, will ravage your heart, will pervert your mind, and will eventually devour your soul. Like the Hebrews at the Red Sea, we're standing at the water's edge. We can remain enslaved by our fear of others, or we can take the risk of crossing over to the other side. With God's guidance, we can break free and forge a new and better future.